Hello, Sophie. Thank you for coming and connecting.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's absolute
Can
pleasure.
you give a little introduction of yourself? Like I saw that you are in some fight sports and also in
Yeah.
psychology and philosophy. So can you give a little introduction of who you are to get the idea of what kind of person you are?
Oh, yeah, no, of course. So my mainstay as a businesswoman is I run obviously a coaching business in the sense that I'm a personal trainer. However, more so now I'm branching into psychology and philosophy because I'm now getting a master's in cognitive psychology and have plans on expanding upon that and getting a neuroscience or therapy related degree so I can really improve and expand
Neuroscience.
my coaching. Yeah, I love it. I love it. So I am a personal trainer and I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a hobby. But my main concern was when I started in the fitness industry was not just be one of those coaches that tell you how to, move and just do some reps.
Yeah.
As I said, I'd say I'm more of a coach, and I'm not ashamed of the label personal trainer at all, but because of my interest in the human brain and the human condition, it's what I on the side of in terms of giving myself a
Yeah.
name for my business because it's just more appropriate for what I try and achieve and try and get
Yeah.
out with my clients.
It's actually similar to what
So,
I do because I
mm,
I have bachelor's in applied sports psychology and I can call myself psychologist. So I'm a high
mhm.
performance coach.
That's really cool. That's really cool, though. And as you know, the mind is so pivotal to how
Oh
people
yeah.
move and how people perform, right? It's essential to even creating a platform in order to actually get stuff done or achieve certain performance or fitness goals in the first place. Um, so I also I'm a writer. I write for various outlets, and I've got a non-fiction book coming out in October called Fitlosophy. So it's incorporating philosophy, psychology, and habits with fitness and how we
Yeah.
can amalgamate old wisdoms and new research together with habit change and how we can kind of make a more bespoke, personalized approach to the way we want to actually lead healthy, fulfilling lives. Um, and I've always been really fascinated and in studying tandem with philosophy.
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said for understanding who we are and I guess to an extent why the things we do, not to a ruminating degree whereby we're essentially giving ourselves obsessive compulsive disorder, but understanding what we can do to empower ourselves
Yeah.
in situations where we might feel a bit more powerless. And that's what I really try and emulate or try and promote within my sphere of coaching and my writing and my general brand as a whole. So
Yeah.
that's a little bit about me. And in terms of my fighting sports, I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I love it so much because it actually cements, ironically, with its ethos and philosophy and message and general I guess background in terms of what it's trying to teach and promote within its students. It really cements exactly what I do. So
So
it's
so
something
what
that
is it that it teaches or promotes for its students? Like what are
so,
the, I don't know, main lessons?
yeah, it's funny because obviously the main lessons, obviously you're trying to break someone's limbs or trying to choke them or trying to control them.
Yeah.
But I think it's often compared to
That's actually
where
interesting, controlling others.
it is really interesting. You're trying to control a situation which is very uncontrollable.
Yeah.
A lot, you don't want to get into a fight in real life because of the chaos. And where there's chaos, there's risk of injury, there's risk of serious harm to yourself or others. There's risk of not knowing what to do and feeling completely vulnerable and helpless. And it's within that chaos that jiu-jitsu teaches you to remain calm. It teaches you to remain, I suppose, to a greater extent, acknowledging your vulnerability and knowing your strengths in that situation. So you have the mainstay, the main frame, so to speak, or blueprint of what it's trying to do, i.e., you have a system of trying to control limbs or a person overall, an opponent overall, make them uncomfortable and ultimately get a submission via a joint break or choke or what have you. So
Yeah.
obviously that's the materialist way of looking at it, but obviously through what you learn and through your various classes and as you progress through the sport, I found that it transcends just fighting and getting hurt. And it's combat sport. That is the point. You go into class and you will get beaten up. You
Yeah.
will emerge slightly more battered version of yourself, but also a better version of yourself, so to speak. There is that simply put, the idea that it's a fighting sport, but I personally get so much more out of it And
It's
it's
way
totally okay if
more.
you
I
just think,
think
yeah, there's
unless you
nothing
are
wrong with just
into that,
doing it like
like
that.
I think people that have never been, I actually want to, one of my goals this year is to start some sort of like boxing or something like that, to
Mhm.
experience that, like, and learn from it, because there's so many lessons that come from it. And I think anybody who thinks that it's just about punching the other person, they haven't really done it themselves or actually see behind the scenes what actually it is about.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because as we've discussed already, the mind is the precursor to everything we
Yeah.
do. So you can't carry out a sequence. You can't even imitate a sequence of your instructor, let alone carry out the required task without your brain, without your mind. The two are interchangeable, really, especially now with the whole mind-body problem going on. You can't undertake any of that without a greater understanding. My personal experience. Some people can just see it as, I'm here to defend myself, I'm here to hurt someone, and not in a
Yeah.
not in a sociopathic way. It's just it means to an end. You're in a very trusted situation, you're in a very safe environment whereby you tap or you say no, it's enough. But some people just see it as that, and that's absolutely fine. But I see it also as a way of getting you mentally and emotionally stronger, of teaching you how to overcome hardship, or to be calm under hardship and look for problems, look for solutions to problems. It is a very problem solving orientated sport. And so for me, when you're learning something like a martial art, you take on so much more of the ethos and discipline than you would, say, just running on a treadmill for an hour. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. But when I'm undertaking a sport like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it makes me feel good because I know I'm improving myself in some capacity, or I'm working hard to overcome my weaknesses and follies. And that's a very empowering thing. We can't control being human. We can't control being imperfect. It's quite a beautiful thing, in fact. But we can control how we approach that. What are we going to do in the face of our own mortality, in the sense that we know there's so much of us that is wrong with us, in everyone. Obviously there's varying degrees, but there's so many flaws that we have. How can we face that inadequacy? In a sense, we can either run away
Yeah.
from it, or hide away from it, or play the victim, or we can actually look it square on in the eye and say, no, I'm going to use this to get stronger. And I really like that about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because there will be, you will suck at the beginning, you will.
Yeah.
And that's the point. But it's not about run, it's about facing that and not running away from it, and
I think it's
learning and
even like
turning up.
enjoying the fact that you're not good at something, because now you see
Yeah.
that you actually have a lot to improve, because it's way harder to actually keep going when you're expert, because then the difference between level where you are and the next level, it's so small. But
Mm-hmm.
when you just
Mm-hmm.
start off, you can instantly see the progress, so you can
Mm-hmm.
actually enjoy it. It's more enjoyable than actually when you're at like really high level.
Oh my goodness me, it is. And as you say, it says incremental changes, and there'll be one week where you just don't get anything, or you always get
Yeah.
beaten, you always get tapped out, and then suddenly the next week you get a move that you couldn't get before. It felt really stodgy and sluggish, and now suddenly it feels a lot smoother, or it feels more natural. And actually, what I love about this, and what I love about my career and my research when I'm looking at stuff to help with my clients, is that the holistic, and I suppose the more philosophical, intersects perfectly with the more empirically based research of the neuroscience. Because when you're looking at things like motor learning, skill development, for instance, there is a level of, yes, you need to make errors because it's your nervous system attuning itself to the stimuli facing it. So you won't be perfect at first. In fact, if you're perfect at first, it means your nervous system isn't learning a new skill,
Yeah.
essentially. We actually want those errors
That's a good
involved when
point.
we're learning. And it's what I tell my clients as well. They get very disheartened and beat themselves up when it comes to training something or doing a new movement or exercise, and I'm like, no, this is actually how you learn a skill. And when we take that ethos from, I guess you could say, the more neurobiological element of movement, and we compare it with the more philosophical attitude of, yes, you're going to suck at first, but that's a good thing. You
Yeah.
can't grow without that. The two, in a very harmonious, amenable way, feed into one another, and they
Yeah.
really do coincide so beautifully. It's funny how stuff like that happens, how the less empirically driven, more holistic ways of analyzing and navigating the world do actually support and complement, I guess, the more materialist, more quantitative data that we have, and we need both. Neither one is neither one should be shamed. You can't have one without the other in terms of learning how to live a purposeful life, in my opinion.
I think like everything is connected anyways. Like even when you look at like art and science, I had a person on my podcast that's a good friend of mine that he's both engineer and artist, and he said that most of the time we don't live for math, like we don't live for like numbers. We actually live for those experiences that come from this art and things like that. But a lot of times we underestimate the value of those things. We just think that we just have to focus on, like, I don't know, money, career, moving ahead, which is important. But I think and I was like that until I learned, so actually it's really important to rest or to do something. Let's say in my case, each year I'm trying to learn something new outside
Nice.
of what I'm doing. So I'm exploring myself as a person, which is another interesting thing I want to touch on is identity. Because I think even when you train people, and I remember I had a conversation with one taxi driver, um, more like Uber driver, one day, and we were talking about how many times there are so many coaches, fitness coaches that are in really good shape. They had never been out of shape. So they can't really understand somebody who has never been in shape. What is it that they're going through? They're like, I don't get it. Why can't you stick to the diet? But they're like, I have never been able to stick to the diet. I have never been able to actually be consistent with my exercises. So many times it's hard for them to understand their clients because their clients are having different identity. And I think if you're somebody who has gone through those experiences where you overcome yourself, you can actually understand those clients better. But at
Absolutely.
the same time, you have to help them to shift their own identity where they don't see themselves as this like unfit, unhealthy person.
And I think you hit the nail on the head there as well. I think people assume that people are born with an inherent knowing or understanding or mind reading
Yeah.
capacity of others, and actually it's not true. And if we look at the research, it's interesting because even though trait levels of empathy, i.e. how much levels of, like, I suppose, other orientated personality traits you have, there is a genetic and biological component there massively, and there's a massive influence in the way you understand and interpret other people and their actions. For instance, when you're looking at neurodivergence, there is not necessarily a difference or lack of empathy at all. It's not necessarily that, but there is a difference in how they process scenarios and situations on a cognitively empathetic level, and there's nothing inherently bad. There's nothing bad about that. It's just what the data is observing. So we can see there's some kind of biological primer for empathy-driven traits. But what's also really interesting is that the research also indicates that pro-social behaviors, which we can kind of define as, let's say, behaviors that orientate people in to be more social, more pro-social, or more orientated around community or interpersonal connection, as a very loose definition, they can be practiced and they can be attuned. So the example you gave, for instance, about the trainer or the coach who has always been in shape their whole life and has always trained really hard, they are going to struggle to really connect with, say, a single mum who is struggling to keep in basic shape with children, or hasn't trained for 5 years, or a very overweight client who feels very insecure about going into the gym, for instance. So these are things, it's not about necessarily going out and doing a method acting lived experience thing, but it is necessary for that coach to step back, maybe even do research if they just don't even know where to start, and understand that person's experience, upbringing, socio-cultural environments, constraints, even systemic constraints, right, political constraints, will have a totally different impact on the way they interpret their environment. So we're trying to intersect here the neurobiological with the sociological as well, because both they're needed. And so it's really interesting that you make that point, because I think we are sometimes at a point in the fitness industry where it's very much cold cut, where calories in, calories out, it's the data, it's this and that, and actually you're not actually looking
Like
at the
you cut out
whole.
the human factor out of
Yes,
it.
they're not robots. It's not. And even sociology has constraints in its research, because that as an issue in social psychology as well, the replicability factor, because we are trying to empirically measure things that aren't necessarily quantifiable. How do you measure people's helpfulness? There's only so many metrics we can use. and it's a very nuanced, contextual driven primer. So we have so many difficulties in how we measure it, that to assume we have to just use numbers or suggest the only answer is X, Y, Z based on these calculus or on scientific discoveries. It's a good start, but I don't think it's thorough enough. And I think it means people don't necessarily develop that capacity for pro-social and, dare I say, empathetic behaviors, which you've touched upon.
Yeah. That's, I think it's really important to actually understand a person and what is it that they actually need or want, because sometimes, and it's not only in fitness environment, it's in any environment. When you communicate with somebody, a lot of
Yeah.
times we assume we know what is the best for them, and
Yes.
sometimes we are able to see something that they might not be able to see. That's different. But something else is that you assume you know what they want or need, but you actually haven't made sure they are in agreement with that. You
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
assume.
No, and you know what? That's so funny, because I think that is a cultural trope, a social cultural trope. It's like, even if we take it from a relational, interpersonal standpoint, we are taught that people should do what we want or expect them to do, and we should get angry when they don't do what we want. And it's a bit like we can't read
Is there
minds.
like
And
what role does ego play in this?
exactly, it's interesting. I think in terms of ego, how would we define it in this conversation?
I don't know. I think I was just thinking, let's say if you assume that, let's say, everybody has to act certain way, or you have certain expectations, then
Yeah.
it means that
Yeah.
you believe that you deserve something. And
Yes.
it's different if you actually deserve it, but something else is that you actually just assume that you deserve it. So I think that's
Yes.
where ego comes in, when you, and then you
Mhm.
for some reason get angry to them for them not meeting, like not meeting this like expectation. So that's, I think, where ego comes in, where you actually can work towards like changing it, or working towards not allowing that ego to get in your way.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there with that level of like entitlement of I should be this, or or I deserve this, or people should treat me
Yeah.
well. Well, newsflash, sometimes the world is very unjust and very unfair.
Yeah.
How will you cope with that? How will you communicate your needs? I think it's all very well that we always look at other people wronging us, and it's wrong, and it's not nice, and it's not fair, and it's nasty.
Yeah.
But also we have a role to play, in the sense that we are accepting or passive towards that dynamic. So we don't necessarily speak up for our needs, or we don't communicate our own needs. And also we're not trying to see what the other person needs, because there could be a massive mismatch
Oh yeah,
there
we
of
always forget
expectations
that
and
everybody else
desires.
also has needs.
Oh,
It's
exactly.
not
And
just us.
exactly, and it's what you mentioned about projecting, or our expectations, or what we think the client or the person wants. Oh, you must be here to lose weight. No, I want to actually get some energy to play with my kids. Actually, I
Yeah.
don't really, losing weight is not even what I want. I want to be looking at movement. I want to be looking at being pain free, for instance. These are metrics that we often get lost in the ether,
Yeah.
based on our own societal and psychological constructs. And it's the same thing in general terms. We don't get taught how to communicate, or even how to listen to other people's needs, their experiences, their own volitions and desires and fears. We kind of just assume people are us, which is a very solipsistic, it's actually in philosophy, it's called solipsism basically, and it's basically assuming that our own experience is the only experience, our own
Yeah.
experiences other people's. And that's not to be saying people are narcissistic or arrogant or selfish. It's a very human thing to do. It's a bit
Yeah.
like, oh, why didn't they text me back? They should text me back. Why? What happens if they might not have done this their whole life, and you're projecting something that you might have received or you
Yeah.
might do, but they don't even have a clue that you're upset by it, because it's not even in their MO. And that's healthy. It's a good thing to be different. We're all human.
Yeah.
It would be more worrisome, I think, if we all had the same goals and dreams and desires
It
and
also would
experiences.
be more boring.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to trade. I like when I'm training my clients. It's so nice. I've got different clients. It's wonderful, actually.
Yeah.
It's amazing, and it ensures that I'm attuning and sharpening my skills as a coach. I'm not just hopefully not a one-note woman. I'm someone who is actively seeking to research and learn and better myself based on what a person comes to me for. So if they come to me, and obviously I always refer out if I feel like there's something out of the scope of my practice, of course. But if it's something that I can manage and is within the realm of my coaching ability, but it's new, rather than shy away from it or think, oh God, this person's not for me. I think, cool, great. This is going to be really helpful for me. And it also means that I have to show up and work really hard to provide the best service for this person and help empower them to live a good life. So it's actually a great opportunity to do the work for yourself and to develop empathy and pro-social attitudes towards others that you might not have had before that experience. So it's a good opportunity. I think it depends totally on your mindset for it. You can think, oh God, like this person's just not my person, or you can think, oh, this is really cool, I can learn
just a
something
new
from this.
challenge. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
I think like another thing you said about the when it comes to communicating, that when we assume, like, a lot of times, let's say if I have certain expectation, even like let's say when somebody doesn't respond back, if a lot of times we start to take it personally, but the approach that I have adapted over years is to actually ask them, like, even like when let's say they respond with certain emoji that you think that this in your head it means this, and you just ask them and they're like, oh no, I mean this, and I'm like, okay, cool, now I know for the future that this is what you actually mean. And it's nothing personal, it's about learning to, well, first, pretty much like what you said, not to assume that everybody is like we are, and then be curious to actually try to understand how they communicate, what is important to them. Because let's say if for somebody family is important and for somebody's career, you will not go to somebody and give them business all the time if their main focus is family, like, or you won't have main conversations, or like you won't catch up with them and be like, so how is your business going? You will ask about their family because that's their priority. So
absolutely
important to understand what is important for them, and then the next step is to actually accept it. If it's not in the same rank as it is for you, it's okay. Like, that's their life, accept it. Like, for me it's really straightforward, but I think for many people it's a challenge where you think like, well, what do you mean family is more important?
Oh, absolutely. It's a bit like that cognitive dissonance, and it is also unfortunately a product, I think, a byproduct of that socio-cultural conditioning. I don't want to say codependency because it's now a clinical term and it gets bandied around like narcissism and gaslighting to the point
Oh, it's
where
like even
social
condition.
media, it's now, people are now misusing it. But it's a sense of,
How would
if
you
you're not
describe codependent, then how people use it and what is the
yeah,
right way to use it so that
that's a
we
really
are
good
clear?
question. So codependency often gets bandied around with this notion that if you even, so I'll give you the clinical definition. They kind of have a framework for it. Is when there is a sort of, I guess you could call it like a quasi obsessive interpersonal relational need to be with someone no matter the experience. So it's often associated, for instance, with someone who is struggling with, say, an addiction, which is obviously terrible and sad, and the other person also almost acts as a caretaker, thinking, oh, this person will change and it will be better and we'll have a really loving relationship together, and if I can just show them that I love them, or if I can just show them this is that they're going to be better soon, things will change.
So the
It's that kind of,
codependent person is the one that is trying to help them or show that it's
yes,
different. Okay.
yeah, exactly. And there's a sense of, it's weird, it's an unusual dynamic because they both essentially need each other in that dynamic, obviously for different reasons. One might be for that emotional validation, or to feel like, oh, I'm loved in this
I
relationship
think like
because
it's about a difference where you actually need them.
yes, yeah,
Because the
exactly,
person that is giving you support, you actually need that support to get better. But for
they become
them,
almost, yeah,
they don't actually need you.
no,
Yeah.
exactly. And it becomes it becomes quite an ensnaring cobweb of back and forth whereby, let's call the person caring for the other person despite their behaviors,
Yeah.
can't leave or doesn't want to leave, based on many variables, psychological and even neurological variables. And obviously the other person doesn't want the other person to leave because that is their source of soothing and emotional care and
Is it like
psychological.
usually that it's codependent person and narcissistic person that they kind of
Yes,
attract each other?
that tends to be the, again calls it the formula.
Yeah.
But again, it's not as common as social media will have you think.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the term
And also
codependent is
there's like
quite broad.
variable extent, how
Yeah,
extreme it is as well.
exactly. It's a bit like, having a bad time in your life versus clinical depression. The two are
Yeah.
different. Same principle you can apply here. And so, for instance, in social media, codependency is often misequated with, wanting to spend time with people, or wanting validation from your partner, or wanting to do something nice for your partner, or actually not wanting to
Yeah.
stay late at work and actually
So
spend
how
time
would
with them in
you
the
call
evening.
that if people think
I'd
of
say that's
codependency?
that would be a pretty I don't like the term normal, but I would say it's a pretty adaptive response to being in a healthy partnership. But again, the term normal and healthy are so relative, because
And I think it
people
also might just
relationships are
come
different.
down to self-worth as well.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So it is normal to want to spend time with your partner. It is normal to want validation from your partner. I mean, I don't like the term normal. I really don't. But
Yeah.
I also dislike how it's being pathologized as
Yeah.
codependency, because it's not.
So
It's
where do
not.
you know
And
where's the balance between, okay, this is not codependency and this is codependency?
I think that's a really good question. And I think it's, again, all relationships are different and all people are different. And there's so many nuanced variables. You can't
Yeah.
just categorize them black and white. I would say there has to be a sense of, I guess, losing yourself completely to the relationship, the dynamic, or the other person, whereby you're losing out on hobbies, you're losing your daily meaning, you're losing significant amounts of time, working on yourself or your hobbies or your familial or French platonic interests. I would say there's almost it's symptomatic of pouring your whole sense of self into that
Yeah. So it's
person.
like they become your life.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
There's nothing else. And it's very healthy for them to obviously share your life and be part of your life, but
Yeah.
the relationship is not your world. It is
Okay. So I have a
it,
I have a
go on.
good question about it. So how to make sure, because I think many times when people get in a relationship, that person becomes their world. So how to make sure that you still have this relationship and it's healthy, but you don't make it your life? Because
Mhm,
I think it's really fine line.
mhm. I think it's super interesting, this, and I think a lot of it, you can't. I think one of the difficult things about giving generic answers or generalized answers is because a lot of how we interplay in relationships stems from upbringing, experience, even some instances of childhood.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's genetic, and it's often a lottery draw in terms of the dynamic you choose with your partner or partners. I would say a big panacea or antidote to losing that notion of losing yourself or feeling really, really, I guess, like a limpet or a
Yeah.
barnacle. Like, you can't possibly leave this person or your whole life will collapse, because you did, obviously that's the other extreme. I suppose an antidote to that would be maintaining hobbies, maintaining interest, developing a sense of self, and exploring notions of self-worth. So for instance, when people pursue people who are unavailable, and I say that in a loose term, people who might be emotionally unavailable, people who might be literally unavailable, who are just too busy to see them, you know, an amazing account I love for this stuff like this, by the way, for listeners, because this is something I'm fascinated in, because it is interlinked with psychology and philosophy, but I think he just nails the stuff, because he specializes in it. He's a
Yeah.
sex and relationship therapist. He's called Your Diag Nonsense, Todd. I think he's an amazing account. So he talks about this really eloquently. Cannot recommend him enough. I love his stuff. Also, he makes me laugh every single day, like on the stuff he posts. It's great. And he discusses the idea of pursuing low self-worth. So each time we're pursuing things that actually aren't serving ourselves in terms of enriching our lives or giving ourselves meaning or pleasure or satisfaction in a longer term payoff, we might be pursuing something that is indicative of how we see ourselves. So if we're pursuing someone who isn't interested or who is too busy to see us, and we're constantly chasing after that, that could be us trying, even if it's subconsciously, trying to ascertain the teachings we've had in our lives saying that we're not worthy or that we're not
Yeah.
enough. And we're trying to confirm that, even if it's on an unconscious level. And I think it's a really interesting theory.
Oh
So
yeah.
you want to be doing things that that actually affirm your worth and affirm your sense of self, developing interests and hobbies and friendships that give
But
you
I
a bit
think
of
like
zest
what you
for
just
life.
said about those things that pretty much like give you feedback about your self-worth. I think a
Mm.
lot of times it starts with you being aware of what is actually the self-worth you see. Like that's one thing that I
Yes.
usually tell about having high standards, that maybe some people that set themselves really high standards, it's not about setting high standards, because I'm all about having high standards. It might be just
Yeah,
that you set them so that you have reason to beat yourself up for not meeting them.
absolutely.
So it's being
Absolutely.
aware of your self-worth and seeing how you actually are manifesting that proof outside of you of that actually being true. And it's not only about self-worth, it's about anything, like let's say health or like well-being, finances, business, whatever, or like social. Like I know that for me, for a really long time, I was thinking that, well, I'm not good with people, like I'm not that social, I'm like introvert and things like that.
Mhm.
And that's when I would just naturally have certain patterns that would just reinforce that. But then when I
Yeah.
would talk to people, they're like, oh, you seem like really extrovert and really talkative and
Mhm.
you're good with people.
Sure.
And I'm like, okay, so there's something that I'm not seeing, but
Mhm.
it's really about the glasses that you're wearing. That's what is defining what you're actually going to see.
Absolutely. And I do think there is actually a lot of research there. I know people try and think, oh, it's woo, like manifestations. And I don't like the whole looking into a mirror saying how amazing you are concept. I don't really like it.
Yeah.
I don't think it actually gives you a firm sense of self. However, there is some really interesting research dictating that the things we, when I say to ourselves, doesn't necessarily mean to ourselves physically or literally, but the things we tell ourselves or the stories we are telling ourselves, whether it be through hobbies or through words or through writing, does have an impact on our moods, emotional
Oh yeah.
state overall, and also our actions. So there is a level of I guess you could call it self-fulfilling prophecy when we are discussing these things. And again, that doesn't mean saying to yourself, oh, I'm awesome, I can do this. It's actually being honest and accountable with yourself, because if you
I
go the
was
other
about
way,
to say that it's so
yeah, otherwise
important
you
to be
never
honest.
better yourself. You
Like
have
let's
to be
say
honest.
if you're out of your shape and you tell like I'm fit, I'm
Mhm.
fit, I'm fit, you actually see you're not.
Denial. Yeah,
But
you're
like
delusional.
yeah, exactly. And I think like that's I recently spoke up in one clubhouse room where they were talking about these affirmations. I can agree with what you're saying. It's
Sure.
really important to the thought the thoughts that are in our head. But then if you tell yourself something that you know it's not true, you
Mm,
just start trying to lie to yourself about something you know it's not true.
mm,
So I think it's like even when it comes to, let's say, if you're out of shape, just approach it as even like adding the word yet.
yes, exactly.
I'm not in
It's
shape
so
yet.
simple. Exactly. And I think actually there's some again, just going back to when I mentioned things like rumination, sometimes we ask too many questions about like, why did I do this? Why am I doing
Oh
this?
yeah.
You get into that cycle and then you're not actually solving anything. Whereas
How you
where,
stop that? Like
well,
I literally like few I think it was a few weeks ago when I was going on a walk and I was like, maybe I don't have to understand everything. Sometimes you just have to act and
yeah,
take that leap. So how you know like when to draw that line when you actually, because like that's another point I wanted to make, is that it's not just about having affirmations, it's actually about starting to act on them. They go
mhm,
hand in hand.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think again, just looking at some of the research, there's some really cool stuff on just changing that why to what. So generally speaking, ruminating we can kind of loosely define as this overt obsessive way of thinking about a particular subject, and it's almost like you can't get it out of your head. It's like a gnat or a mosquito just buzzing about your
Yeah.
head, and it's almost impossible to swat away, and it takes over your energy, it takes over your life. You're spending your days, rather than me, for instance, if I'm worried about leaving the oven on and I'm ruminating about that and I'm obsessed with thinking about, oh my god, have I left the oven on? I'm here having a conversation with you, but I'm not here. I'm in
Yeah.
my head thinking about the oven being on potentially, and I'm just obsessed with that. That could be a sign of you ruminating and actually not being present with your daily life, which is actually detrimental on many levels. So instead of asking why, I know I've given a really bad example with the oven, but it's just an example of when your head is going into
Yeah.
overdrive and you're not being present. The research is actually suggesting that asking what questions tends to be more empowering. So instead of why did this happen to me, I would say maybe like, what can I do about this?
Mm.
Because that's not denying something's happened to you, it's actually acknowledging it, because you're saying, right, this is shit, this has
Yeah.
happened, what can I do about it? Or asking things rather than like, oh, why am I the way that I am, or why have I done this? Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it is useful. I'm not saying, I mean, I love philosophy and we're all about the whys.
Yeah.
Why is useful and it can be fun to
But you
explore,
don't
but
want to
actually
stop just with
ruminating,
at why.
yeah, it's not just a why. Yeah,
Yeah.
if you're ruminating and not taking action, then you're not actually implementing any change, and theorizing and intellectualizing is fun, but if it's just that, you're not actually doing anything to put yourself in a better position. So what's great. I love a good what. So, you know, for instance, it might be like, what can I do today to make do something, what can I do to make today a bit better than yesterday? Or, you know, what is it that I'm really seeking? What is it that I'm really after? What is it that's making me feel this way? Okay, what can I do to make myself feel better? These actually are open-ended, they are slightly more open-ended than why, to be honest, because you're not going down a spiral. You're like, no, I'm going to think of an actionable plan, and that's very empowering.
And many times, like, we don't even know the why. I think that's another thing. Is
yes, exactly.
You might. It's more likely you will know the answer to the what than you will to the why.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You'll probably never know why, especially if it's about situations or people. Good luck trying to understand another human being. We are incredibly complex and flawed. And actually, that's quite freeing to be like, you know what, I probably don't know why, but I can do something about it. I can ask a what. And that's very powerful when you're faced with a blank slate where we like to project all our stories onto it. And, you know, as a writer, I know,
go ahead.
You know, I was just saying, as a writer, I know we are excellent storytellers. Humans are amazing storytellers. So we can come up with the most fabulous and terrifying of stories that can bring our moods to right down. So sometimes why can be risky because we're not actually asking, what can I do as the protagonist of my story to
that's actually a good point. When you ask why, you can come up with any story, not just positives.
Exactly. And it's not, you don't have any verifiable, falsifiable proof or evidence, because it's
so you just come up with something because you have to answer the question.
Exactly. And even if you ask someone why or what's going on, you don't know if they're going to ask honestly. You can't guarantee that. So often it's better to be in a position where we're asking more what's than whys.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. And that brings another thing that I wanted to talk about is responsibility. Because just when you talked about, let's say, getting back to the oven, you didn't get in, like, let's say when you ask, okay, what can I do about it? This happened. This is shit. Okay, this is what happened. What can I do about it? And that's where taking responsibility comes in. So maybe you can talk about the importance of taking responsibility, because I know that I know myself from my experience that the moment I start to take responsibility, things start to change.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's a real shame nowadays because we associate, for some reason, responsibility with far right or conservative values. And for anyone who, people have a right to their views, of course, as long as you're not harming people. But to say that responsibility is primarily or purely a right-wing or conservative phenomenon it's false. And also it's detracting from an incredibly powerful source of agency that we have for ourselves. So one of the things that I feel like is missing in the whole discussion about self-care or mental health or psychology or looking after yourself or bettering yourself, it's that the self-care is orientated around things like hot bubble baths or saying nice things to yourself. And that's fine. They have a place.
It has
Sometimes
a place,
it's really bad. It has a place. Of course it does. But what I'm also thinking is, are you actually, if you were a child, would you just feed your child chocolate, or would you just give your child hot bubble baths? No, you try and teach your child right from wrong. You try and get your child to think about life skills, for instance. I know this is very pragmatic.
And that's like one thing that Jordan Peterson has been talking a lot about. Your job as parent is to prepare them for life.
Yes, exactly. It's not your job to completely coddle them. And actually that's probably a very damaging form of parenting, to just coddle them and expect them to not be able to do anything.
I think it's more like definitely.
Exactly. You're leaving them helpless and vulnerable and just, you know, absolutely against all odds in the world. And so I think in a weird way, I know the inner child thing is a bit, there's not actually too much psychotherapeutic evidence for it. It's quite holistic, and that's fine if it works for you. But if we take that concept of an inner child and just think about you as a child, if you were to look after yourself in general, what would you do? You wouldn't constantly coddle. You wouldn't make excuses for yourself all the time. You would see that this child has a future ahead of it, and you'd want it to make the best of it. So you'd be constantly educating and reinforcing and, yes, disciplining to the extent whereby this person or this child can stand on their 2 feet and take on the world and feel strong and empowered. Because responsibility is acceptance and admittance of a world and life that can be very unfair, and it can, and the world and life can be beautiful.
Yeah.
Honestly, you can have the most stunning moments, but you have those stunning moments because you've worked hard to stay strong and accepting and persevering against things that are really trying to beat you down. And
Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. I think that's beautiful. I think if we were given just copious amounts of happiness and joy and pleasure, we'd never actually appreciate the beauty we'd have
Yeah.
in front of us. We'd assume
I
it's
think
the
like
status
another
quo.
thing is that like we never are too interested in looking at hero's story when, oh, I wanted to do this and the doors
Yeah.
opened. Then I went this. Like I wanted to do this, the doors opened. Everything was given to me. Like we
Oh
don't really
God,
enjoy
no.
those stories.
It would be such a boring story, right? The best
Yeah.
stories are almost when the protagonist is forged from fire.
Yeah.
And there's something really appealing to that because, like we've discussed, humans are storytellers. So to really latch on to that figure, that protagonist, and that and how they overcome the obstacle, you think this average Joe has just done that, and you think, well, I'm an average Joe, so maybe I can do something. Maybe
Yeah.
doesn't quite involve massive spaceships or wizarding wars, but it does on some level involve an obstacle, a metaphorical obstacle of some kind that I can look at straight in the eye and think, well, if a little hobbit from the Shire can overcome his fears and go all the way to Mordor and save Dale Tolkien's world, then yeah, I think I can deal with my bills for this month. And actually,
Yeah.
I think it's going to be really good for me because it means I'm going to get a bit closer to being the adult, being the person
I think
I
that's
envisioned
like
myself
just what you
being.
just touched on, that the importance to finding the good in that.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
really important.
Oh yeah, I think a lot of people think, and actually, responsibility can be very boring. I mean, no one wants to clean the dishes or take the wash out or have difficult
I think like
conversations
that's
with
really limited
people.
look at responsibility. If people
Yes,
perceive it
it's
only as that, it's
it's
way
and
more.
it's so disempowering because it means you are just a cog in the machine of life's entropy, and you're just thinking, well, this is really boring and dull. No, but actually, those little gestures, those little habits, those actionable plans on a daily level help you become a person you want to be. And I think what's exciting about responsibility is that you are taking the mantle for the character you want to be in your story. So you're thinking, oh, I really wish I could do this. I want to do this. And you think, oh, but it's too hard. Immediately, you're discounting yourself out the race. But
Yeah.
responsibility says, that looks bloody hard. But actually, if I can just make myself like 1% better each day, if I can just do a little thing each day that even remotely emulates a shell of the person I want to be,
Yeah.
then I'll be happy. Because if you ask yourself, say in a week's time or a month's time, I want to look like this person, or I want to be like this person, or this is who I want to be, then you can work backwards and think, right, what we'll have to do? Okay, fine, I'm going to write that down. I'm going to do this tiny little gesture every day. That's not so overwhelming. I can manage that. And then as a result, when you get there, responsibility feels much more empowering and feels less scary. So then you can start to build
I
up
was
those
about to
small
touch
habits.
on the scary part because I think that's another thing that a lot of times is holding people back from taking responsibility. Because
Yeah,
now, when you actually take responsibility, you can't blame anything else. It's
I know,
on
it's just
you, and
you.
it's
It's just
scary
you.
step to take.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? And I think also, unfortunately, this comes in this lens of perfectionism and also
Mm,
the denial that human beings are flawed. Because if you know human beings are flawed, you won't take any mistake you do personally. You'll think, oh, shit. I mean, I'm a human being. Fine. Okay, what can I do to make it better? You're not going to think I'm an awful person that
how would you
deserves
describe that mindset
self-isolation.
that you need to not to take it personally? Because I think, and I have talked to many people, even like when I was reaching out to athletes, so many athletes told me, which I didn't expect, that their biggest challenge is perfectionism. So, like, how to
Yes.
approach it where you actually embrace those mistakes and you actually even enjoy them, because
Mhm.
that's another way how to learn.
Yeah, I
Not the
think
only
that's a
way.
really no, absolutely, absolutely. And I do think there is a sense of the world is bigger than you, and that really helps take the pressure off. Ultimately, there is there
I
can be
think
a
there
sense of,
also comes an ego again.
yeah, no, totally, totally. And it's so easy because I know I do this still, and it's very common to be like, oh my God, I didn't do this, which means this is a disaster, or that means I'm never going to achieve this. I'm like, whoa, hang on a second. I'm not that important in the grand scheme of things,
Yeah.
actually, which makes me more motivated to work hard because I feel like, well, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm not going to be perfect. And thank God I'm not, because the life would be very boring. My story would be very boring. No
Yeah.
one would want to read
So
it.
how would you, like, let's say now that you said that, okay, I'm not that important, but then there are people
Mm.
that enforce you to feel like you're important, you're important. So how
Oh,
would you explain it to them that, like, in a way where it's not that you're not important, but it's
sure.
understanding, like, where do you find that balance? Because I think so many people would be like, this is not the way you should think.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they'll think, oh my God, you hate yourself. It's like, no, no,
Yeah.
no. It's good to have a healthy sense of self. So it's really important. And you've hit the nail on the head there. There is a sweet spot to be had, right? Whereby we're not loathing ourselves and falling into kind of a depressive chasm of, oh my God, I'm horrible and I hate myself and I'm worthless, I mean nothing. It's more of a freeing experience. And Albert Camus talks about this really well in his absurdist philosophy, where he says the universe is pretty, whether or not you're absurdist or not, I think it's quite a nice way of looking at things. The universe is very apathetic to me. So all the suffering I have, even it's not actually personally directed at me. It's just the way it is. One must imagine Sisyphus rolling up the boulder up the hill happy, because ultimately that's the only meaning he can make in this madness, in this chaos.
Hmm.
He looks it in the eye and thinks, this is not a personal slight on me. This is just how the universe is kind of working. And so when people say things like, I'm special, I'm unique, I'm important. No, I think actually human beings are bloody special. I think we are
Yeah.
lucky to be born. We could have been born a tree. We really lucked out on the evolutionary process of being born, right? We're so lucky. We're the lucky ones. Most people, as Richard Dawkins said, most people, not that I agree with him on everything, but most people were never lucky
Yeah.
to be born in the first place. So there is a degree of uniqueness there, but it's whether or not we really want to die by on that hill, because I feel like if you're constantly saying you're special, there's a sense there, or an implication there, that you're just happy being the way you are, full stop. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that means you have to change or fix anything. In fact, it's far from it. Self-acceptance is incredibly important, and
Yeah.
compassion, you need it to actually change, ironically. But to think you are like a perfect little snowflake who can do no wrong is a dangerous ideology, I think,
Oh
because then
yeah.
you'll never be able to recognize when you commit wrong to someone else. And
Oh
I would say
yeah.
to that person that it's not about you not having worth, inherent worth as a human being. You have that. You're born, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. But it's also a waste to assume you're perfect the way you are, because no one is. And
Yeah.
actually, it's incredibly exciting to look your flaws in the eye and think, right, what can we do with you? What can I do to get you better? What can I
Yeah.
do to make myself a bit stronger each day? I think it's incredibly exciting, and it's a shame to let that potential fall on the wayside. And it's not about being really tough or stoic or dogmatic or hyper masculine. It's simply owning your humanness, having fun with it, having that playfulness there of like, no, actually, you know what, this universe is so vast and beautiful and amazing. I am so lucky I'm born. I could have just been a flea or a microscopic amoeba, and I'm here. And because I'm living in this vast universe, and because I'm in this vastness, is my mistake in the grand scheme of things going to make have a massive chain of impact in how
Yeah.
the universe is working? No. But that also means it's almost contradictory, because I'm in a sense not that important, because we're subverting the nihilistic thought process here. Actually,
I think like
everything that
another
I
thing
do
that
is
you could
important.
use is that being humble.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a weird paradox, because
Yeah.
yes, no, you're technically not important enough to have an impact, but actually you are,
Yeah.
because we are social animals, and we are driven by communication and interpersonal occurrences, and how we connect to others, how we find meaning. We're meaning making animals. So if we just think I'm special, I'm so important, I'm this and that, you get lost in your own world, and
Oh
you
yeah.
forget there's communities, there's people out there who could use your strengths. And if you're always thinking, okay, I have a duty, a bit Kantian here, Kant's philosophy, I have a duty to do well and to commit good things in the world, because of this fragility of me as a human being, because I'm kind of in the middle, right? Of I'm in this vastness and I don't really mean much, but actually I am important. I am pretty cool as an animal, as a being.
Yeah.
How do I juggle that? Well, I do have a duty then to try and reconcile the difficulties the world faces, and just doing a little bit of doing something positive a little bit more each day,
Yeah.
to counterbalance that on a spiritual, holistic scale. Don't mean spiritual in a religious sense, but more of a holistic ideal. And so actually, if you're constantly saying I'm important, you negate that need to do good because you think you're already good. You're not acting as if there's something greater than you are. You're
Like
acting as though
that's
you
that's
are the
usually
great thing you are.
when I tell people that the moment you think that you're expert, you're not expert anymore, because you close
Yeah,
yourself off from actually continuous learning, because you think you know
exactly.
everything.
Exactly. It's almost, it is that hubris, it is the arrogance of assuming you don't need to do anything.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't need to do anything, but sometimes you do. And it's also very much trial and error, knowing where to go with that. And I say that to my clients, it's okay for you to not know or to make errors. Actually, like we discussed with the skill development in neuroscience, it's how we make errors that we learn motor skills. And I would say that's almost across the board, universally applicable to real life. We need to learn how to navigate certain situations by making mistakes, by making these errors.
Yeah.
We don't adjust internally to how we navigate our kind of blueprint of how the world and others work. So it's actually imperative we go out there and take the risk and make mistakes, or we won't genuinely, sincerely learn what the world is really like.
I think, like, how would you approach it where, let's say, many times the more you, when you're at the beginning, it's easy not to get like arrogant or too much in your head where ego takes over, because you know nothing, you're nobody. But let's say as you move like ahead and you become somebody that is, let's say, significant, or somebody that has impact in society, how to make sure it doesn't get in, like it doesn't affect you or get too much in your head, but you still stay like humble and don't think that like the world is like turning around or circling around you, whatever the expression is. So like how to make sure it doesn't get too much in your head and you still keep progressing, even though around you everything technically shows that, well, you're it, like,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question. And I think this is where, like, as a coach, I try and instill things like core values. And it's about thinking about your values and how you want to live in terms of concepts that aren't tangible. And by that I mean, rather than having a core value of wealth or success, it might be empathy or learning. So even if you are a multimillionaire and you've got people hanging off your every word, you've got a plethora of dating potential, for instance, and you're quote unquote successful, you look at your values and think, am I being kind or empathetic? Am I consistently learning? Am I being open, or am I spending time with family? That could be a core value. Figuring out your core values keeps you grounded, because no matter how you climb that totem pole of societal hierarchy, you're always checking whether or not you're coinciding with the values you set yourself.
Yeah.
And if you're not, then it means you're kind of off piste, and then you develop that sense of detachment and grandiosity, thinking, oh, I'm the shit. But are you the
Yeah.
shit though? Because if you're not a very nice
So
person, or if you're not
how
very
you
honest, I don't
create,
really
like
want to hang out with you.
how you find out those core values? Like how do you create them or come up with them?
So there's some really nice tactics that I like to use for myself and for my clients. Some things, like some examples I like to give are, for instance, stepping back and thinking about a situation that filled you with not necessarily happiness, because you can go to a candy store and eat loads of chocolate and that gave you a spike of happiness, but I would not put eating chocolate as a core value of mine. An event or situation that gave you kind of a sense of meaning or satisfaction. So it could be one time you trained really hard for an event at school and you won a race. So it could be that, it could be indicating to you your core value could be like determination or hard work. Or for instance, you remember a time where you got your family member an amazing present and you saw the look on their face and you just felt that warm happiness fill your body. And you could look at your core value then as being empathetic or kind or something like that, as an example. And slowly but surely you start to chip away at things that you really get meaning from. And the beautiful thing is everyone's will be different. So you talk to people, like we've discussed before, with business and family.
Yeah.
Someone's event, for instance, that made them feel that warmth or that drive, that they're really pursuing meaning, that dopaminergic boom, yep, you're going on the right path, my friend, you're doing life well. For them it could be like, oh my god, like I got my first deal at age 25 or something like that, and that gave them that boom. That could signal they are more business orientated. Someone who might be more family orientated on their core values list, it could be that, one time we had an amazing holiday together and we felt really connected, and I just felt so grateful to be with these amazing people, something like that. And you notice that event and how it made you feel, and then it gives you a better indication
Yeah.
of what your core values are. And it's also like even little things, looking at your interests, your hobbies, things that really make you smile, or give you meaning in your day. They can be clues as to what you value. So for me, for instance, creativity and learning, those are kind of two interlinked values of mine, because I'm always reading, I'm always writing, I'm always wanting to find out more. If I didn't have that on my core values list, I would be doing something wrong, because and it's great for me. For instance, if I'm really busy, and if I've got lots of clients, or if I've got a busy, hectic week, and I haven't, for instance, read in a day, I feel sluggish, and I'm like,
Yeah.
but I'm not living in line with my values, and that's why. So they are a great kind of compass or guiding post that signal when something's slightly off in your routine, and they're like, you should maybe step back and give yourself some time to reevaluate where you're at, and just make sure that you're kind of on a right path to feeling meaningful.
Yeah.
Because meaning trumps happiness in my eyes. Happiness is something that you inhibit. It's not something that is
I think
automatically granted
the
to
way I
you.
approach happiness is that it is a byproduct. You
Yes,
can't achieve
absolutely.
happiness just by focusing on happiness. But like
Absolutely.
one thing that I wanted to add is one exercise that I read from Robin Sharma. He said
Oh yeah.
that imagining that you're at your deathbed and thinking, even like let's say in your funeral, how you want people to remember you, what you want them to talk about, what you
Mm,
want them to say about you, and you can that way you can create the kind of person you want to be and live accordingly. Because many times we that was something funny that I heard. I don't remember who said it. That we a lot of times we know that we are not going to live forever, but we just
mm.
think that everybody else is going to die, but we don't think about ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
But like that's I think I had another question about what you were talking about, but I think I forgot it, sadly.
No, no, it's fine. Values are a big one. And I think what you said was really interesting as well. It's that notion that we are mortal is actually a great galvanizing kick to
Yeah.
do something meaningful with our lives. We're not going to be on this space rock forever. So we have the choice to lead the lives we want to lead, and to be people we want to be.
Yeah.
We want to we want to be people that we want to hang out with. Or I really like, I found a quote on Instagram, and I must say some Instagram quotes are quite sweet and wholesome, and I like this one. And it's be someone that makes other people's nervous systems feel safe. So someone you can be open with, honest with, kind, empathetic, or just hold space for someone, or just is a person they can trust. It doesn't make them feel hyper vigilant or also super avoidant if they're feeling like
Yeah.
it's too much, and it's actually not a safe space for that person to process what they're feeling. And I like that, because it's empirically driven, of course, but there's that holistic element of just
How you
holding that
create that?
energy. That's a really good question. So we have some measurable, like we have some metrics we can use. So eye contact, open-ended questions. When someone's talking to you, making your listening more active. So not interrupting them, but also acknowledging you're kind of there. So things like,
Yeah.
yeah, totally. That must be really tough. As a coach, I have to do this a lot. It's you almost become kind of pseudo-therapeutic with it. That body language is really, really important, and also matching your voice, and also even imitating that your gestures with theirs. There's some really interesting studies on imitation showcasing that people are more likely to interact with pro-social behaviors if they're being mimicked, and vice versa. Mimicking
Yeah.
is a funny one. We really
Because
want
then
people to
I
like
think
us.
it's
Great.
because the neurons in your brain start to
Mm,
become active in a similar way. But I think another thing is that the way I usually tell people about is because I think I asked you this because it has been something that I have always been really curious about, because many times people tell me that they find it easy to trust me or talk to me, and I'm always curious about why. And like one thing that I usually tell people when it comes to actually having these conversations which is really important for that person to feel safe to share things
yes,
with you. It's crucial. If they don't feel safe, they will never tell you anything. um,
absolutely.
or maybe they will tell you only enough that they feel like, okay, I'm in control enough. But
Yeah,
I think really, really, really important thing is to approach them with curiosity and as a blank
yeah,
page where
no
you
judgment.
don't, when let's say when they tell something to you, you don't think that the way they think or the way they approach things is wrong. You actually try to
No,
understand why they think that way they do, why is
absolutely.
that important for them. And that's where
Mm.
you just pretty much remove yourself from conversation, especially your ego.
Oh
And you
God,
actually pay
absolutely.
attention to them, and that's where they actually feel heard, and you can give them that feeling of you understanding them because you actually try to understand them. It's not about,
Mhm.
oh, I will try to understand this so that I can use this in my, like, for myself so I can get something out of you, but you actually try to understand them and it's all about them. That's when people start to feel safe and they open up to you. um
Mhm.
but like that's, and the moment you try to get something out of them, we are really, really, um in a way, special beings where we can sense that something is off.
Mhm.
You can sense that something is off with the person you're talking to.
There's that intuition, yeah, as you say, because we are so primed to not be rejected
Oh yeah.
socially, we can tell when something's amiss. Now, sometimes that signal, I guess you can call it that, can be I guess thrown out of whack by things like anxiety, depression, because obviously
Yeah.
if you've got issues with signaling on neurotransmitters, or what, there's lots of theories, of course, we can't pinpoint it to one theory, but if there is potentially a maladaptive processing of information within the brain in terms of interpreting information around us, then yes, that's going to impact the way we view others and how they view us negatively, or in a way that's biased, of course.
Yeah.
But I do think there is a sense, you can walk into a room and or feel like you are the black sheep, or there's a deadness or a tension in some conversations that you feel like, oh, it's not going anywhere. And so we are very intuitive to, I guess you can say,
I
our
think it takes a
people,
lot of
or
patience to
oh God,
stay in
yeah,
those conversations. I have had
oh
many of
I know,
those, and I'm like
oh I know, I know.
trying to pay attention, and be present. But and even then, I'm not so good at faking things. So if I'm
Okay.
not so interested, people will see that, and I
Yeah,
am I am okay with it. I'm like, you know what,
yeah.
this is not of interest for me, and at some point I just stop engaging in those conversations, and people just learn that, okay, we're not talking to you about this, and I'm completely fine with that. I don't feel
Yeah.
left out. I don't need maybe that, like, which is another thing that I want your maybe insight on, that fitting in, that and for me it took me forever to, I always felt like I want to feel understood. I wanted to get that connection with people, and I'm really good at communicating. I would explain the way I think, the way I approach things, and people still wouldn't understand me. And one big lesson for me was to learn to accept that it's okay if you don't understand me. That's fine. I will just
Mhm.
focus on understanding you.
Mhm, 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 mhm. And I think that's so crucial, and fitting in as well, as it's a really interesting concept. I find it's a fascinating topic of discussion because, again, yes, you have those Instagram quotes being like, don't fit in, be you. And actually, I'm very much of the proponent of that we should be ourselves and be wacky and
Yeah.
embrace our little quirks and flaws, because that's the path of self-acceptance. But paradoxically, when you do that, you are accepted by others. It's not because you're fighting the wave, it's because you become a more genuine, grounded person, which happens to
Authentic
be very
person as
likable.
well.
So you end up making friends with people who like you because of these traits. So
Because you're
to
not
say
faking
that
it.
it's not faking it, exactly. So you end up being surrounded by really cool, like-minded people anyway. And to say, to promote this idea of the lone wolf or the black sheep is, I think, somewhat dangerous, and also it's not in keeping with the research. We do like to have in groups and out groups, whether or not that, and that this, I'm not saying that's a good result. Overall, we need to be looking at that and analyzing the way we can tackle, for instance, social justice issues with that, because that's a really interesting concept that might have some grounds in those fields, looking at the psychology and the neuroscience of it. But we do need to have some kind of communitarian aspect to our lives. Doesn't matter how introvert you are,
Yeah.
you need to have that. It's what makes us thrive and helps us understand ourselves. Because the thing is, yes, we can have really great quality relationships, I mean that familiarly, platonically, romantically, professionally, if we know ourselves, of course, but also we are defined by those relationships. So if you're constantly surrounded by people who aren't necessarily meeting your needs, or you're feeling like you're walking on eggshells with them, or you're not feeling like you are connecting to yourself, or feeling like you are a black sheep, then that's a question of whether or not those relationships are right for you. And it's
Yeah.
important to cultivate relationships that are very emotionally and mentally, psychologically satisfying, because you'll perpetuate this victimhood of, I'm the black sheep, I'm left out, and it's a vicious cycle. Then you don't want to create that community. So fitting in, not wanting to fit in, is kind of like pseudo rebellion. I think it's actually better to accept the fact, no, actually it's nice.
I actually was about to add, so when you were talking about that quote, that one thing is that you don't try to fit in just to fit in, but something else that you purposefully try to not to fit in. And that's when you go to extreme, when you're not yourself anymore, because you're like, oh, I don't fit in, I'm this like special person. That's the other extreme, when you're not yourself anymore, and people see
exactly exactly it's overcompensation. It's almost like kind of
wanting
deny.
attention.
It is, and it's just denial of the fact that we thrive off relationships and interpersonal kindness and kindred spirits, that kind of thing. And I do think as well, no one likes someone who's high and mighty thinking, I don't need people. It's a bit snobbish.
I was actually about to say this, that people don't like when you say you don't need people, but if you actually yourself are in a place where you are like, I don't need anybody, it doesn't mean that you're now pushing everybody away, but you're not in this need. You're like, if somebody comes in your life, awesome, but
you're not, if they don't, also awesome.
Get somebody, you're confident within yourself, which is something that I'm trying to explain to people, the importance to learn to be comfortable and confident within yourself, or you're okay being alone, because there will be times 100% when you will be alone, especially let's say even now, like with lockdown,
with pandemic.
And that's usually when I tell people, like, it's not about you pushing everybody away, it's about you learning to be completely okay being by yourself, learning to take responsibility, take action, actually sort yourself out and get yourself to a better place where you don't need anybody else. But if you want some help, you can get it. Like, it's finding that balance where you're not in a place, I don't need anybody, and you're trying to tell that to yourself, but you actually feel that I'm actually confident within myself and I don't need anybody, but I still will use some help to get ahead.
Oh god, yeah. And you think friendships are lovely and I love my family, and
exactly.
Or it's healthy to want human connection. It's not a crime. In fact, it's part of who we are.
Exactly. And like the way you said it, that you want it, it's not that you need
it.
Exactly.
Exactly. It's healthy to want to connect with others who care about you. It's part of our innate evolutionary drive, basically. But it is that case of, ironically, when you go the other extreme of mass people pleasing, you're actually kind of doing the same thing on the other scale, because the other scale is saying, I don't need anyone, I'm on my own, but you're actually really crying for help. You're actually saying, I'm on my own, I'm on my own, I'm on my own, someone please fill this gap for me. The other one is also saying, I'm on my own, I'm on my own, I'm on my own, please fill this gap for me, but you're just communicating it differently. So they're two sides of the same coin, and it's really hard, I think, to juggle that sweet spot, or that intersection of, no, I'm just happy being me, and that means having people in my life, and if they want to be in my life, cool. If not, cool. I also have other things and people who are meaningful to me, and that's significant.
That's like where you actually have your own life.
Exactly. And that can take a lot of time and error, and it can also mean sometimes you have to go through each extreme to finally get that nice ricochet, because you're like, actually, no, this isn't a fun way to live, and that's not a fun way to live. Surely there's a better way, and there is a better way. And it's really interesting as well, because I do find the more we deny, for instance, our needs, our own needs, and also human needs, our needs emotionally, physically, psychologically, professionally, the more we deny these needs, the stronger we actually project them, or the stronger they seep into our lives, because we're just denying it and they're coming up.
Can you give an example?
Like down. Oh, so a good example, to be honest, is what we just described, that constant the constant denial, the constant refusal for human connection. Or I don't mean that in a romantic sense. It can be friendship, it can be familial, it can be saying, I'm on my own, I'm strong on my own, I can do this, I can handle this. And I have definitely done this in the past. And there is obviously, it's on the one hand, it's very important and good to be able to be self-sufficient, but there's self-sufficiency, and then there's obviously loanership. And so when you're doing that, you're actually on some level, you are telling people, I'm on my own, please help me. even if you're not consciously aware of it, because it seeps out into your behavior. You become quite hermited, you become quite
Yeah, I
introverted,
think
you
it
become
also
quite
is the
sad.
way you communicate it.
Yes.
Where you're like, yeah, makes sense.
So it almost seeps out into your behaviors because you become much more insular, and that
Yeah.
is telling people, God, this person needs a hug. And so
Yeah.
the way, and it's same when you go to the other side of this, I guess we could call it people pleaser, or I suppose this chronic, almost clinical need to have someone right by your hip. You're actually showing people you are lonely because you are needing that person there. You can't be without that
Yeah.
person for, or these people or your community, for a significant amount of time. So inherently your behaviors show up what you really think or what you really want, which I find really
Yeah.
fascinating.
Like that, a good example is pretty much like my experience in past, where I would always help everybody. But
Yeah.
there was a point when I realized I wasn't helping just because I wanted to help. I was helping it because I wanted to, like, it's pretty much like feeling good about myself, or like fulfilling that like low self-esteem or something like that. And when I understood it, I was like, oh, okay, so this is something that I just have to work on. But
Yeah.
it's really important to actually, which is really, really important, and I keep telling about is being self-aware and actually working on being aware of your
Mhm.
patterns of yourself.
Yeah.
Because if you can't see how you are behaving on what you're doing, you can't
Mm.
change it, like you,
Mm.
because you can't see what actually to change or work on.
Exactly. And actually, self-awareness, as we've discussed, is not the same as self-flagellation or
Yeah.
obsessive rumination. Self-awareness, actually, there is an acceptance there of having your quirks and having your flaws,
Yeah,
and
I think like
paradoxically they
self-awareness is just you kind of detaching and just looking at facts.
yes, it's more objective. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's less of a hold there on the way you're
Yeah.
viewing things. Less of an emotional fixation, for sure.
Yeah. That, I think detachment is like where you don't um identify with emotions that you have, where you still feel them. Because like, let's say when you have good emotions, you just want to have them, but then when you have bad emotions, you want to get rid of them. But
Mm.
like, we are human beings, so you have to experience those emotions. And like, one thing that I was reading, I'm not sure if it was like a fact, you might feel the same, where let's say when somebody has had like traumatic experience, a lot of times we suppress that emotion, and then when it comes to, let's say, years later they do trauma work, a lot of
Mm.
times it takes, I think it was like 90 seconds for you to experience that emotion. Then it leaves you, and you pretty much have like, in a way, resolved that emotional trauma because you actually lived that emotion. But when it happens, it feels like forever, those 90
Yeah.
seconds. And that's when we suppress it and you don't fully resolve that like traumatic experience.
Mhm. Absolutely. And also it's no, you start to learn that actually this emotional pain, as horrible as it is temporary,
Yeah.
because sometimes we feel like there's no end to the tunnel of what we're experiencing. But the emotional states, as you've rightly put it, there is a temporariness, there's a ephemeral nature to them, because emotions essentially signals from the nervous system pinpoint, oh, something's wrong. You can feel them physiologically, whether you're
Yeah.
anxious, you feel that prickling in your skin and the heart palpitations, or if you're feeling sad, you feel sluggish. You're feeling despondent, you're feeling like you don't have much energy. If you're feeling excited, you might be looking around, you might be having a bit more pep in your step. There are physiological responses to our emotions, which signals to us that it's a nervous system response, and the nervous system can be regulated through time and certain actions such as breathing or distractions or self-soothing stuff, or doing activities that distract your mind from the emotional setback. And we can't control the emotions that come in. We can't control our nervous system having a response. Like, we can't.
Yeah.
That's like completely out of our hands. But we can respond in kind. So we do have control how we respond to the nervous system or emotional response, and react in it in such a way that it's productive and we learn something about it.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like brain training or muscle. It's like going to the gym and getting those reps in. The more you practice regulating an emotion or understanding or stepping back from emotion, the more you practice that detachment, the easier it becomes.
Yeah.
Because you start to realize, actually, I know exactly what I need to do to have that step back and be objective about it and understand it's temporary and feel the feeling. It's not about denial. People think it's repression or denial. It's not. You're still feeling these emotions. You're vocalizing your upset or your disdain, but it's just not in the sense that it's going to cause more problems in your
It
life
doesn't
at
mean
that
that you
moment.
have to act on those emotions.
Exactly. That's the thing. And I think a lot of people conflate that nowadays. You know, people think that pardon me, people think, you know, it's not about expression either. We can be very angry and punch a pillow or cry. These are healthy. These are how we express that nervous system response. But it's also understanding that we are not those emotions. How can we be something that's transient? We're not. We're much more than that. And understanding that it's a transient state of who we are is actually quite freeing, and it's peacemaking, because you look at what you're experiencing and you think, this is, I am the much more than the greatest sum of my experiences or my
So what would
emotional
you
reactions.
say is that, who are we? Like, how would you answer that?
It's a really good question. Depends totally on the philosophical thought of that you
Like, how would you answer
undergo.
it now? Because probably like 1 hour after this, it would be different answer or different
Oh
name.
yeah,
But like,
totally.
how would you answer that question like now?
I think I'm of a school of, I like existentialism and I like Kant, which is weird because they're actually two, not necessarily, yes, in the sense they are diametrically opposed, but I like them both. So I'm a terrible person. I'm gonna take a little bit from either, because I think in terms of layman's terms, it's quite nice. I think we are meaning making creatures. That's the existential part, whereby we are storytellers and we like to engage in story, and we like to find certainty in the uncertain, and that's almost impossible. And now I'm going to bring in the Kant. We are creatures trying to create stability in the uncertainty, little anxious beings as we are, and as a result we are valuable inherently because our actions mean something to others, because they can make or break their feeling of safety. So we are creatures whereby morals do matter, actions do matter, and the things we put out into the world have a value. This is what I think. I'm not saying this is fact. I'm just using it based on some of the readings I've enjoyed. So as a result, we can have a guide, if we use that as an example slate or blueprint for how we're guided to behave. What we do in matters of emotional distress matters, because how we react and how we talk to people has a lasting impact. And as Kant uses the example of not using people as means to an end. So basically, don't use people. Basically, they are in of themselves their own people. Where you begin is we are a separate entity from them. There's no enmeshment. There's no using. There's no borrowing from who they are. And because they are ends, people are ends. They're not means to ends. As a result, we should treat ourselves as such. And so we should treat ourselves as people who are capable of moral agency and people who are capable of making meaning out of others' actions and our own. So in a sense, I think we are bound by this search for meaning and morality, I think.
So
I think it's always
why do you think it's so important for us to have this like meaning?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question.
For it like everywhere. It's like meaning for life, like what is my purpose? Or even like when it comes to like some certain, let's say I don't know, let's say your grandparents die and you have this like one ring left from them, it's really meaningful. Or like art, something is meaningful. So like we keep searching meaning in like everything. It can be big, it can be small, but like why do you think it is so important for us to look for this meaning or like search for it or try to find this meaning for things?
I think it's such a great question, and actually it feeds back pretty nicely to when we were talking about when we need more whats rather than whys. Because no matter how many whys we reduce our lives to, and how many whys we get rid of and cross off and replace with whats, human beings will naturally, we like certainty, we like to create depth in our stories. And I think partly it might be because, do we really want to get up every day and just go to work and is this it? And there is part of that, I think, that plagues our consciousness and our entities. But I think a lot of it is trying to grapple with the question of who we are and what are we doing here. it might not be a conscious thing, and I mean, I know I'm an overthinker and love philosophy, so I'll think of it more than others, but I do think it's a gentle susurration, a little whisper in the background of how we live our lives. It's like a kind of like a white noise thing. And so meaning, finding little joys, finding things that cultivate or sculpt out some kind of purpose in our day, that, for instance, even little things like, you know, saying to the shopkeeper, keep the change, you know, giving some money to the homeless person, or even just ringing a grandparent, or helping, better yet, helping, if God happens to anyone else, you know, helping someone with the grandparent's funeral when they're in an emotionally distressed state. All these things add meaning to our lives. Now, you could make the argument, oh, we're just a bunch of cells, we're just here for a short time, it's a good time. No, not necessarily, because if you live that way, you'll feel, I think, fairly empty.
And you are still
because
giving some
lives,
sort of meaning to life, that you're here to have fun. So it's still a meaning.
but is that meaning though? Because if we were
How
to
would you
create a
define
story,
meaning?
I think meaning, it depends. I think it depends on the framework and the blueprints that we're using, because often different philosophers will also use it semantically speaking. But I think
I have a
meaning,
definition. Okay, define you, and I will read you a definition that I found online.
Oh my goodness me!
Give your definition.
That's not fair,
first.
asking a philosopher to do that.
No, like it's just like, then we will add to conversation, but like, how would you define it?
Of course. So I think that meaning is a depth or a clarity that lends us structure and a framework when there wasn't. So it's a bit like a skeleton. If we weren't in a skeleton, we'd just be a bunch of flabby cells. But meaning adds structure. I don't mean that in a routine like sense. I mean it in a sense.
Structure is more about like the control.
Rigid, yeah. Whereas meaning, it's more like I guess tree roots. It's supportive. It's not necessarily restrictive, but it supports us. So it's something that we help fall back onto and during hard times. That wasn't a very good definition, so I'm curious to hear.
I would say that's pretty good. Okay, so let's see what the internet says. Well, the basic one is statement of the exact meaning of a word, especially a dictionary.
They can't use meaning in a definition. Sorry.
Okay, so let's say the degree of distinctness in outline of an object, image, or sound.
Okay.
I think that's the one that we're talking about, that meaning.
Okay.
Yeah, it makes sense, but like,
yeah, distinctness is a good term actually, because it's distinguishing the menial from the meaningful. And just basically distinguishing as well what you should give a fuck about.
It's pretty much about like going more in depth of understanding something, and what it means. But I think even like when it comes to defining words, I think it's so hard to do that when you actually define what the word means. And sometimes I use it because English is not my first language, to understand words, or because there are some words that you can't translate, where if you do translate them, they are not, it's not the same meaning. Even like word legit, you can't in my language, like in Latvian, there's no word that can explain that word.
That's amazing.
It's just like I was trying to, me and one of my friend was trying to explain to this friend what legit means in Latvian. We just couldn't explain it. And he's like, what do you mean? And I'm like, I don't know how to explain it to you. It's just a word that if you know, you know. But like the meaning, I think it's, like as you said, like even when it comes to going to work. I was actually reading today about which goes a bit into this, that many times when we go to work, you're not really going to work for the sake of working for somebody else. You're going to work for the sake of providing your family. So that's the meaning that you actually add to the work.
Yeah, exactly. And meaning can be as simple as that. It doesn't have to be transcending the gods of time, but it can be, okay, I need to provide for my loved ones, which is massive. You are literally proving to be the breadline for other human beings. I would say that's massively significant in terms of adding structure and meaning to your life.
I think like how would you tell people to approach, let's say there's so many people that are like, well, I don't know what's my meaning of life, or what's my purpose, or
Mhm.
like, why am I here? Because some people, they know straight away, okay, this is my thing, this is what I want to achieve, this is who I am. Some people, they
Yeah.
don't know, they explore it along the way. So how would you help them to approach it? Or maybe, because I think many times it can cause people to become emotionally down or upset and
Yeah,
things like that.
quite anxious as
Yeah.
well, because it's like, oh, quite agitated. I don't have my
Yeah.
ring to take to Mordor. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%, 100%. So I always go the values thing I really like, because you're not saying there's a right or wrong action, but you are giving yourself guideposts for who you want to be and how you want to live. And then you're following things that give you that satisfaction, and help you wake up in the morning thinking, this is what this is what I would like to be or behave in such a way. And you're getting closer to having a more concrete idea of the actions then that need to take place to really further cement that in. So I think core values are a massive contributing factor to finding out like what you want to do. I hate that term, what you want to do. I mean, it's just,
Yeah, or
it doesn't
like
really
who
mean
you
anything
are.
nowadays. It's just, yeah.
um
Yeah,
I
but
think
I
like
find
another
that,
thing might be that you, like, I don't know, sometimes the way I try to explain things is that, like, it's okay if you don't know, like, you explore along the
yeah,
way. And like, I think
exactly.
many times people come back being like, well, I will waste my time, like, I'm afraid to waste my time on something that is not me, or something like that. And I'm like, well, you'd never waste time as long as you learn something, or you get
Exactly.
better, or you understand yourself better. It's never a
Exactly.
waste of time. I think it's
And
impossible to actually see something as waste of time, as long as you
I completely
actually
agree.
find something positive in it. And not like positive in a way that it's, oh, positive like rainbows and everything, but more in a way that you, it's positive, where you learn a new lesson, you learn something new about yourself, even if it's a bad experience, or you know that, well, even as simple as you learn what exactly is that you don't want to do.
That's it. That's a positive experience. You're like,
Yeah.
that didn't work for me. Didn't work for me. Not compatible with me. And that's as important as knowing what you do want to do, because you're crossing off, if you
Yeah.
cross off one thing there, then you can look at the traits of other similar activities or paths or people and think, these things have all the same traits as that,
Yeah.
which means I am not going near it. So it's actually very informative of your lifestyle at large, and helping you see and narrow down things that do work for you.
Oh, like another thing that I wanted to add is, which is pretty big one, not to look at others or compare yourself to others.
Mm.
Like, I think that's a lot of times when it comes to um finding your meaning or your purpose, a lot of times we look at others and that others have it, and that's when we feel like, I also have to have it because this person has it. So I think that's
Mm.
when you start to look too much at what others have or don't have. That's when you start to think of something that, I don't know, maybe that you lack something, or you need something,
Mm.
or things
Mm.
like that.
Mm.
And when it affects you negatively.
Hmm. And I think that when you're comparing yourself to others, you're completely detracting your own story. You're putting
Yeah.
yourself in that place of powerlessness. I think comparing yourself to who you were yesterday is bloody brilliant.
Oh yeah.
You're looking at like, oh God, yesterday was a bit of a write-off, and I can do better than that. My standards are higher. Versus, or actually, I liked who I was yesterday. If I can carry that on for the next like next week, imagine where I'll be next week. That's really encouraging and
So
really
how to make
empowering.
sure you actually look at compare yourself to yourself, like yourself yesterday, instead of somebody else? Because now we have a lot of social media, a lot of
Yeah,
stories out there that we can
yeah.
look at and compare ourselves with. So how to make sure you don't actually get affected? Because I think, like, it's usually the way I approach it is that it's okay to see what others are doing, and you can get some inspiration because you see what's possible, because they're also human. But something
Absolutely.
else
Yeah,
is that you look at it and now you start to compare where they are with where you are, and then that affects you negatively, where you actually start to take less action or move ahead less, because now you start to feel bad about yourself, and it goes in circles.
yeah. I think that's a really great question. And I do think social media gets a little bit um it's obviously, it's got massive problems. It's got, of course, social media has problems, but we actually don't have enough data to conclude decisively
Yeah.
what it causes. So it's problematic in the sense, if you're spending all your day scrolling or ruminating on photos or what people are doing, that's also as problematic as someone going to the gym for 8 hours a day and having no other life. And obviously, if they're a top athlete, different story, it's their job. But in this pursuit of a hot looking body, for instance, both are problematic behaviors or maladaptive behaviors. But I think it's very human, as you say, to compare, because of that in-group out-group theory that we talked about earlier, and the desire to conform and to have socially abiding interpersonal relationships. I think when it comes to, and it's not something, it's important as well that I'm not just saying my opinion or espousing it, because anyone can talk about this, like, I think we should take off social media. It's not necessarily about that, but based on some of the research and data we're looking at when it comes to people's well-being and comparisons, limiting social media does help because you just don't have it there. But also, I think having more other orientated things in your life, so volunteering, things that are more about the other rather than yourself. It sounds paradoxical, because then you think, oh, but you're dealing with other people, so surely you'd compare. But actually, other orientated makes you more likely to engage in pro-social behaviors, and therefore you're going to be less concerned about your life compared to someone else, and more concerned about the bigger
It's
issues
like when you
and
have
the world.
too much free time, then you start to think thoughts
Of
that you
course.
shouldn't.
Exactly. It's almost like that. It's almost fill your brain up with something that's proactive rather than destructive. No, for sure. There's absolutely an element of truth in that.
Especially if
This
you
is a
haven't
really,
done some self-work and you're not actually able to be, not like able to be alone, but where it's actually affecting you badly, or you're not able to control those thoughts or direct them to where you want them to go.
absolutely. And I do feel like um there is and there's lots of data to showcase that happiness. We're looking at people think, how does one be happy, or how does one have peace of mind? The evidence seems to be emerging more and more that having an other orientated attitude, i.e. more pro-social behaviors, actual more extroversion, actually, so actively seeking social engagement, tends to have a better self-reported levels of happiness, which is really interesting, because people often glorify the ear of the introvert. And as someone who loves a good book and to unwind from social situations, I understand that. But there's also something to be said for connecting with other human beings, and that
And
can
connecting
massively
with the
improve our mood.
right people, not like toxic people.
With people who I like to, it's that idea of surrounding yourself with people who are good for your nervous system, and also good sources of, I guess, blueprints for how you want to live your life, because then you can get an example of what they're doing and try and copy it, in a sense, in a way that's beneficial to what you want to become.
I think that's the way I would approach it. So let's say if I want to start doing something or learn something, I will find people that are like experts in it, or are like few steps ahead of me, and I will learn from them, and I will observe what they, and like not in a, like as you said about that, like copying, you copy it your way. It's not about like
Exactly.
becoming them, unless it might be something that you aspire to be, that might be a bit different. But even then, like you can't really be exactly like somebody else. You can
No,
only, because like you will never actually understand them fully, because most people they barely understand themselves. So
exactly.
like I think it's, and that's a lot of times is what, when it comes to understanding people, that we think we understand others, but especially if, like I think in relationships it's a lot of times the case that, which is another interesting thing. I had a conversation with my mom, and she said that sometimes she can literally read my dad's mind, what he's about to
Right.
say. And it's so interesting, because like I was, I don't know where I read this, but it was about the fact that a lot of times, couples that have been really long in marriage, they actually get so used to the other person that they become like one. They become like an,
Yeah.
pretty much like one entity, where this person is responsible for finances, I'm
Yeah.
responsible for cooking, you're responsible for this, I'm for that.
Yeah.
And then you also add to each other, like personality wise, where you literally become like one. And once you lose that person, it feels like you have lost part of you.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost like part of that limb, like we discussed earlier, that sense of this person was literally a
Yeah.
building block of my life, and now that building block is gone. It's
And it's even
horrible.
like in
Yeah.
healthy relationships, because
Mhm.
you spend so much time with them. Let's say if you spend 50 years living with somebody,
Mhm.
it's like, I don't even know how you can imagine yourself without them if it's been that long. They're like
Absolutely.
part
Yeah.
of your life.
Yeah. That's why breakups really suck, because it's not just about, oh, it's a dissolution of a relationship. There's so much life experience you've had,
Yeah.
and also hopes you've had with that person. It's not as simple as cutting off time, I'm going to feel better. There's psychological,
And
neurobiological,
also
and
a lot of
philosophical.
memories that you will still
Yeah, you
have
can't get rid
with
of
them.
memories. No, and the process break. My heart goes out to anyone going through a breakup right now. I've been there. It's really horrible. It takes time and patience and kindness from people, because there's ups and downs, and there's going to be emotional baggage for a while. But like with any good story, there's going to be better chapters ahead that you'll look
Is there
back
a
and think
way
you'll
how
use
to,
leverage.
like, with that emotional baggage, is there a way how to actually maybe shift it where you actually embrace it or find something positive in it? Like, what would
Yes.
be a good approach to approach it for you
Um.
actually benefit from
So
it?
so time is a massive one, because of the close connection between emotional and physical pain. You're going to be in a lot of pain. The brain does not like rejection, or pain like this, because it indicates potential separation, or literal harm or death, as
Yeah.
per our evolutionary ancestors. Time. Some people go to therapy for it and have great results. Therapy is always a good action, and we have some methods from stoicism and existentialism whereby you're utilizing like the pain and the experience you've had, and making meaning out of it, making meaning out of a relationship dissolution. So there is something to be said for being proactive and not blaming yourself. Actually, studies have shown people who blame themselves are more likely to undergo a lot more breakup pain and depression after a
Is there
relationship
like a
dissolution.
certain patterns why, like, why certain people blame themselves, or what are like common, like, maybe characteristics they might have?
So there'll be the research suggests that there might be more likely to have higher levels of trait neuroticism. So neuroticism is
Yeah.
generally characterized with depressive episodes, anxieties, a fixation on how they appear to others, not in a necessarily a narcissistic way, but because they want to, they're worried about what people think of them, need to be liked, etc. So unfortunately, as you can tell, it's a recipe for disaster when there's a breakup involved, because breakups are complex and messy, and very rarely is it one per I mean, it happens. Very rarely is it just one person being an arse.
Yeah.
It's not often, it's often circumstantial, or there's a dynamic thing missing there. It's not
Yeah,
because
there
of
are
two
like
horrible people.
events that lead towards
Yeah,
that.
it's horrifically complicated, which is why it's also horrifically painful. But someone who is more likely to err on the side of those personality traits will have a harder time disengaging from self-blame, because they'll inculcate themselves so much with what happened, and they'll assign personal fault to it when there is no personal fault to be assigned to. It happens. So as a result, they tend to be, unfortunately, the victims in that parameter. So with breakups, it's good to be self-aware and ask questions. The what's, right? What can I learn from this? What have I learned about this? What have I learned about myself?
Yeah.
What works for me? What can I do now to make sure that I'm looking after myself? What can I do to look after myself because I'm my own adult? Things like that can feel empowering, and give you power in a situation where it can feel very, very vulnerable. So it's messy and it's horrible, but often time, what questions, and avoiding self-blame can be really, and it's hard with the self-blame, because you think, oh, if I've done this, if I've done this, and it's the moment you see the other person as a complex, flawed human being just like you, is the moment it becomes easier, because you think,
Yeah.
no, it's not that simple. Changing a sentence or an action is never that simple, really. Again, generalizing, there are some forms of betrayal, for instance, that become
Yeah.
almost, that's a deal breaker for someone's values, and that's hard to repair. But when people say, I should have texted them this, I should have done this, it's never that simple, and that
Yeah.
that doesn't solve the complexity of a
And that's
breakup.
also like you keeping, like, you still living in the past. So like I think that's another thing, is that learning to, as hard as it is, learning to still live in the present and be like, okay, this is situation right now.
Yes,
um
acceptance. Yeah.
Sometimes we want to, yeah, acceptance is huge. Sometimes you want to go back and try to resolve things. But then again, I assume that you have done it enough times before that breakup actually happened, when you learned that this is not working. But like, how would you approach that when, let's say, there are many people that they have been in relationship pretty much their whole lives.
Yeah.
They haven't really been like, okay, now I'm out of relationship, I'm by myself. So how should they approach it, where, let's say, they just haven't really been like not with somebody?
Hmm. Yeah, that's really, really tough. And that it will feel like a limb's missing from you, because as you mentioned before, inherently we do assign roles in our relationships, even in our
Yeah,
friendships. I've got guy best friends who I see as like my little brother, or I've got gal pals, for instance, who I consciously or unconsciously assign certain roles to in our friendship
yeah,
dynamics, because it's fun and it works that way. And I'm not a different person, but there will be slightly mutable, slightly interchangeable roles in friendships, familial relationships, professional relationships, because we are human beings that like hierarchies and structure in how we understand and navigate interpersonal relationships.
yeah.
So that's hard, because you've assigned someone a massive role in your life and that role is now empty. So it's baby steps again. That's going to be inexorably painful. And the thing that will really help is that slow self-care and self-soothing. Knowing that you can trust yourself to look after yourself is massive, because you've just
Yeah.
had that massive source of care taking away from you. So literally physically doing things like cooking for yourself, going to the gym, things,
Like
taking care
learning
of
to
your
rely
physical
on
needs.
yourself.
Yes, it's slow incremental little steps that help you feel empowered, and knowing that you can actually be independent on your own 2 feet in terms of that self-care. And again, that taking that time out to not blame yourself for losing that source in your life, because that is it takes a lot of time. And I think a lot of cognitive separation from that person having a role in your life. And that's tough, because your brain will not want to see it that way. So it will take some time, unfortunately, and a lot of reframing of the stories you have in
Yeah.
your head to get past that barrier.
Yeah, because then you're the one who actually now has to take the role that that person had, which is harder,
Mm.
and we don't like harder. So
No, we don't like harder. Harder doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, harder can mean it's often very good. It's challenging. It's a good thing, but it doesn't feel like that in the moment, and that's
yeah.
also incredibly valid and something to be to. That's why that the whole hyper masculine idea of like it's tough, we love it. Yes and no. It's life is tough, but that doesn't negate your emotions. Your feelings are incredibly
Yeah.
valid. Things can be very painful and still be done at the same time.
Yeah, I
That
think like
doesn't negate the need for
that's usually
softness
what I
either.
try to communicate to people, because I agree to both. Like, it's not
Yeah, me
just
too.
toughness. It's not
Balance.
like life is hard, and I assume I will never agree that like, oh, it's easy and like rainbows and flowers. Like, I don't see it that way. Um
Mhm.
but at the same time, it doesn't mean that you always have to neglect yourself, your emotions, and like your like more like human side. So like that's like usually where I try to kind of combine them both together, where it's pretty much like trying to combine two worlds that don't really are not really in agreement with each other.
Yeah, yeah. It's finding that intersect. There's a Venn diagram. You'd want to
Yeah.
find that midsection, which is really inexorably hard.
Yeah.
I think the two actually go together. It's about
Yeah.
marrying them, but you do get these warring sides of no, you don't need toughness. We need more softness in the world. And like, well, no, that doesn't make any sense, because
Yeah, it's
why
like,
would you
and
want
then
to be
people
soft
think
in the
because you're
face of tough?
mentally tough, no, you don't care about people. Like,
Yes,
why
they think
can't you
mental
have both?
toughness is cold. They think mental toughness is cold and detached, and it's not the same. In fact, actually, if you're tough, you're able to look after people, because you
Yeah.
can take care of your own emotional stuff and
Yeah.
take responsibility for it, and are able to cope with it rather than be wallowing or feeling like you're overwhelmed. So actually, toughness can mean that you can support yourself and others, which I think is admirable. Also, at the same time, you don't want to be so rigid that there isn't room for that empathy, that
Yeah.
softness, that that ability to just hold space and let that person feel, because that's equally as important. So it's really tough, and I just wish people would respect the fact both are very important in our daily interactions with so many people.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, as everything, it's all work in progress. It's not just that, like, feeling bad about you, not like, even let's say mental toughness, not having enough mental toughness, being like, okay, like, this is just something that I have to work on. How can I work on it? Like, as you said before, like, pretty much like reverse engineer. Okay, this is how I want to become.
Yeah,
What actions do I need to take to become that way? Like, if you look at it, it's pretty simple. Like, it's not that complex. Um,
it's
and like,
doing it.
that's
It's really
another
tough.
thing is that I tell people a lot is that many times we just overcomplicate things. Like, if you
Mm.
think about it, life is pretty simple. Like, even when
Mhm.
when we're talking about fitness, like, well, to get in shape, you just have to look at your calories, your like exercise, water, sleep, things like that. At the basic level, it's like, it's pretty basic. It's not that complex. Um, but then you also have to add human factor, and you have to be aware of those things. But then the more we detach from it and we look at it as facts, it's a bit easier for us to navigate it and actually start taking action towards like those things or change them up. um but yeah, maybe
Mm.
I asked this last episode. I can ask you as well, like, can you give a wisdom to finish off with?
A wisdom. Oh, that's tough. I think aim. This is my motto. Am I saying it's trying
Okay.
what I try and live by? So I'm going to share it onto you. People can steal it, because it works really well for me. It helps steal me in tough times, and it keeps me, I guess, driven to create meaning in my daily life.
Yeah.
So I always try and live by the notion of leaving the world a little bit brighter than when you last left it. Now, that doesn't mean doing grandiose schemes or telling people about how good you are. My
Yeah.
God, please don't do that. But it's literally waking up and thinking, how can I make the world a little bit brighter? It could be saying, how are you to a stranger? It could be ringing your mum. It can be checking in on a friend you haven't spoken to in a
Yeah.
while. Something
Buying a
super
coffee,
simple.
somebody, like,
Yeah, it's something super simple, right?
yeah.
Something super simple. And as a result, I think what happens there, one, you alleviate your own suffering a bit, because if you're in the space where you think the world and life is really unfair and tough, and it is, you're actually countering that. You're thinking, no, it is, but I'm still going to be good, and I'm
Yeah.
still going to be the person I want to be in
It
the
is not
face of all that.
going to change who I am.
It's not going to change who I am. I want to live a way that I'm proud of. And two, again, it's going back to what Kant talked about in terms of having responsibility and people not being means to ends. You are treating yourself and others as ends, as valuable entities on this planet. No matter how long we're on this planet for, it's important that we carry on
And also,
this.
like,
We
no matter
carry respect.
what is their like profession or education or skin color or things like that,
Exactly.
like,
The deserving of basic decency and
yeah.
kindness. And I think it doesn't matter what your profession is, who you are. It's so easy to have a little bit of act of kindness and
Yeah.
undergo an act of kindness in your daily living. It's a really easy way of living a life that gets you to being a bit better than yesterday, and helping the world be a bit better than yesterday.
And
As crazy
also
as it sounds, the
improving your
ricochet effect.
own world and how you feel about yourself. It's not just,
Exactly.
it's like, it goes both ways, I think.
Yeah. Like they
Well,
say, there's no such thing as a selfless good deed.
exactly. Well, that's a really good wisdom. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for coming. It was
I had
amazing
such a lovely time.
conversation.
No, it was amazing. Great. We got through so much. It was amazing.
All right. Well, thank you for coming. Might get you on another time.
Oh, I'd love that.
But this was awesome. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.